What we're going to look at today is measures of central tendency. What I mean by that is how we look at the center of our data. There's going to be 5 different ways that we look at that, and those ways are going to be mean, median, mode, mid-range, and weighted mean. The first one that we look at, mean, is what we normally refer to as the arithmetic average. And that is what we're going to see the most, but we also use the others in our data collection. Before we get started, we want to determine the difference between a statistic and a parameter. A statistic is the measurement that we get from a sample size. So the mean from a sample is going to be a statistic. The median from a sample will be a statistic. Those that come from a population are considered parameter. If you recall, we had the circles where we drew population, and then we took out a little piece of it, and that was our sample. So this was our sample. Okay, so anything that comes from our population is going to be a parameter. Anything that comes from a sample will be considered a statistic. One way to recognize that is the first letters of each word: population, parameter, sample, statistic. The reason it's important to know these is because as we're going through that, we're going to be looking at items in the sense of, did this come from a population or did this come from a sample? And many of the calculations that we do will use different variables for a population or a sample. One might use a Greek letter, one will use the alphanumeric letters. So generally, when we're rounding and looking at anything that we're calculating here, we don't want to calculate until our final answer. The reason why is we want our final answers to be exact as possible. So even intermediate steps we don't want to round. Therefore, it's going to be very important that you get used to using your calculators with the parentheses. And you can do a lot of your calculations all at one time in your calculators, but you will need to know how to do that using those parentheses so that we can avoid any type of error at the end. Now then, the first measure of central tendency that we look at is the mean, what we normally refer to as the average. So this is what we normally look at as the average. It is all of our numbers added up and divided by how many there are. Now if you notice, the symbol X bar, an X with a bar over it, that is pronounced X bar, is used for the sample mean. And so we're going to add up all of our numbers and then divide by how many we have. For a sample, we use a lowercase n. That just shows that it came from a sample. Now for a population, we use the Greek letter mu. And we use also a capital N to determine that it came from, the total number came from a population. So a couple of differences here is the symbols representing the mean. X bar represents the sample mean. Mu represents the population mean. And then the lowercase n represents the total in a sample, and the uppercase N represents the total in a population. We calculate these two means the exact same way. We add up all of our data points and divide by the total number. A symbol here that you will want to get used to is this Greek symbol epsilon. It means that we're going to sum everything up. This is a sigma epsilon, that we sum everything up. And so that just means that we've added everything together. For the mean, we want to round things to one place more than our data. So if we have our data is 54, 72, and 81, then our mean will have one decimal place, because it will be in one more than what our numbers were. But if we had data points that had let's try to get this going. Okay, let me try this again. If we have data points that have 54.3, 62.1, and 89.4, then our mean is going to have two decimal places. Because again, currently these numbers have one decimal place, therefore our mean needs two decimal places. And I left out the n in mean. So let's look at this example. We have the number of short-term parking spaces at 15 airports as shown, and we want to find the mean. So we have 15 different numbers here. So when we're looking at this and we want to find the mean, since we know that there are more than 15 different airports in the country, this is going to be an X bar. So we want to sum up our values and divide by our lowercase n. So I want to add all of my numbers up, my 750, my 690 plus 1479. So I'm going to have 750 plus 690 plus 1479 all the way up until I've added all of them up to my 2516, and then I'm going to divide by how many there are, which is 15. So my X bar, where I add up all of these numbers, that is going to give me 47,619, and I'm going to divide by 15. And I get that on average there are 3,174.6 So the mean number of short-term parking places at airports is 3,174.6 spots. And we would always want to write this out in a sentence. So the mean number of parking places is 3,174.6. And that is our mean. Again, make sure that you've rounded to one more decimal place than what your data starts with. Okay, sometimes we have our grouped data And so what we want to do here is we're going to make a table. We're going to add some columns to it. We're going to start out with our class limits and our frequency. We want to add the midpoint and then a column that says our frequency times our midpoint. We'll fill in these last two columns. And then what we do is we sum up the last column and divide by our n, which is the total frequency. This is the formula that we use, which says the sum of the frequency times the midpoint divided by the total number there is. So let's look at an example. Okay, so commission earned by 100 salespeople at several branches of a large chain store is shown, and we want to find the mean. So we have these class limits. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add two columns, and we're going to find the midpoint and then the frequency times the midpoint. So I've added the midpoint column, and remember that the midpoint, so the x sub m, is equal to the class limits, so 150 plus 158 divided by 2. So I'm taking these two numbers, adding them up and dividing by 2, and I get my midpoint. And I did that all the way down. To get the last column here, I took this column and multiplied it by this column. In other words, I multiplied the 5 times the 154 and got 770. And I'm going to do that all the way down. And then what I'll do is I'm going to add up my last column. I'm going to sum it up. So the sum of my f times my x sub m in this case is going to be 18,028. I also need to know what my n is, which is 100. That's if I sum up this second column and the fourth column. Now my mean is going to be the 18,028 divided by 100, which is going to give me 180.28. We round to one decimal place more than what we start with, and since we started with whole numbers here, we're going to round to one decimal place. So my mean is going to be 180.3. So the mean commission earned by these 100 salespeople is $183.30. So that's the mean commission earned by these people. Again, we need to make sure that we're adding these last two columns, and then we're going to total up column 2 and column 4. The second measure of central tendency is the median. It's just the middle number of our data. The symbol for median is MD, and that's whether it's a population or a sample. It's going to be the same either way. So the median is going to be the MD. To find the median, we're going to first arrange the values in ascending order. That means from least to greatest. We're going to determine the number of values in the data set. If n is odd, meaning the total number of values is odd, then we select the middle data value. If n is even, we're going to select the two middle values and take their average. Okay? So let's look at this example again, the airport parking lots. So here is the information, and the first thing that we do is put it in order from least to greatest. Then we want to find the middle point. Normally what I do is I say, okay, I start marking them out one for one on each end. Okay. And then the one that's in the middle that hasn't been marked out is my median. So for this case, the median is equal to 79. 1,479 is our median, is our middle value. Okay, what happens if there is an even number of places? The number of tornadoes that have occurred in the United States over an 8-year period is as follows. We want to find the median. So they give us this data value. First thing that we need to do, again, is put it in order from least to greatest. And then we want to find the middle point. So I mark out one for one on each end. Oh, but look, I've got two middle numbers. I can't mark them out and still have one in the center. So what I'm going to do is the median is going to be 764 plus 856 divided by 2. And that gives me 1620 divided by 2. So my median in this case is going to be 810. So the median for the number of tornadoes is 810 tornadoes over this 8-year period. So again, if we can find the exact middle number, that is wonderful. Sometimes we can, but sometimes we can't, like in this case, and we take the mean of the two middle numbers. The third measure of central tendency is mode. This is the data value that occurs the most often, the one that occurs more often than any others. Let me say that there are some times that there could be no mode. There can be one mode, two modes, or many modes. For something to be considered a mode, it has to occur more often than another item in the data set. So if they all occur one time, then there's going to be no mode. If they all occur 2 times, it's still no mode. But if all of them occur 2 times and one data point occurs 1 time, then the mode is going to be everything else. So we have to take that into account. And you can have more than one mode. We just list them all the same. So let's look at the airport parking lot. Again, most of the time it's easier if we sort them out first. That way we can see if there's any that are repeating. And if we go through here and look, we see that no, there's no data value that repeats. So this one has no mode. Now if I were to add another 700 on here, 700 would be the mode. So because it would occur the most often. In other words, if I were to replace the 690 with a 700, then my mode would be 700. Let's say I replaced the 690 with the 700. So 690 is gone, and I put 700. But I also replace this 1479 and put a 1962. Now, in this new set that I have, I would actually have 700 and the 1962 as a mode. So there would be two modes in this case. So it all depends on what your data is giving you. Sometimes, again, you will have no mode. Sometimes you'll have one, two, or multiple modes. Go back to the commission earned frequency distribution, and we want to find the modal class. The modal class is the class that has the highest frequency. So in this case, we look down the side with the frequency, and we see here's our highest frequency. So our modal class is going to be 177 to 185. That's going to be our modal class because it's the one that occurs the most often. It's the class that occurs the most often. So the modal class and the mode is still the one that has the highest frequency, the one that occurs the most often. Our fourth type of central tendency is the mid-range. The mid-range takes our lowest number plus our highest number and divides by 2. So we want to take that highest number plus the lowest number and divide by 2. This one is denoted by MR, and again, this one does not have separate designations for whether it's from a sample or a population. So let's look at the airport parking again, and we want to find the mid-range. So the mid-range, for this, we need to identify the highest number and the lowest number. Well, our lowest number is going to be 203. Our highest number is going to be 9,822. So our mid-range is going to be 203 plus 9,822 divided by 2. And we get 10,025 divided by 2. So our mid-range is going to be 5,012.5. Now, if you look back through your notes, our measures of central tendency for the airport parking have had a wide range. Our mean, if you recall, was 3,174.6. Our median for the same data group was 1,479. And now we have a mid-range of 5,012.5. So the measures of central tendency are way different from each other. So you have to identify which one are you going to use and what are you using it for, because it really depends on that as to what you actually want to use. The last type of central tendency that we want to look at is our weighted mean. The weighted mean is used for items that have different weights, such as your GPA. That's going to have a different weight based on what grade you made. Did you make an A? Did you make a B? Also, in some classes, figuring out your grade, each type of assignment may carry a different weight. Exams may carry 70%, homework may carry 10%, a project may carry 20%. And so you can't just add all your grades up and divide by how many you've had. You actually have to take the weighted average. And so what we do is we're going to take each grade and multiply it by its weight and add those up, and then divide by the sum of the weights. And so you kind of have to know what is a weight and what is the x value, things of that nature. Okay? So let's look at an example. This is the cost of helicopters that we want to look at. We have the Sunscraper, the Sky Coaster, and the High Flyer. We have the number that are sold and the cost. The weight is like the frequency. So this is like our weight. And this is going to be our x value. So whenever we're finding our weighted average, we're going to take these and multiply them by each other. And then we're going to divide by the total frequency, the total number that we sold. Okay? So we're going to take the number of Sky Coasters, 9, times how much they cost, 427,000, plus, I'm sorry, that was the Sunscrapers. The Sky Coasters we sold 6, times 365,000, plus we sold 12 High Flyers, and they cost $725,000. And then we're going to divide that by the total number that we sold, which was 9 plus 6 plus 12. And so we're going to get that we have $14,733,000 that we sold, basically, divided by the 27 airplanes that we sold. So our weighted average is going to be $545,666.67. Now I've rounded it to the nearest cent. It went on for a long decimal. You have to be a little bit careful when you're looking at these because, again, finding what is the weight, what is the actual data value. Usually the weight is how many were we looking at, our frequency. In GPAs, it is the grade point average itself, like your 3, 4, how many credit hours things. We'll do some more examples. If you need some more examples, there's some in your textbook. And if you have questions, let me know. So go ahead and try some of these, and then we will continue to discuss them.